This week, Hurricane Oscar struck Cuba, crippling the island's already struggling power grid. This energy crisis highlights what the communist Cuban regime has gone to great pains to hide. That is, the government-controlled economy and infrastructure are crumbling. Now, should America, from a foreign policy perspective, be concerned with what is happening just 90 miles off our coast? Joining me now with his analysis of what is going on is Dr. A.J. Nolte, Chair of the Government Graduate Program and Director of the International Development Master's Program at Regent University. Dr. Nolte, welcome back to Washington Watch.
Tony, thanks, Tony. It's great to be here.
So what should we be watching in Cuba?
Well, there are a couple of different aspects. First of all, I think it would be hard for Americans looking at this to not draw contrasts between our own recent experience with hurricanes. Oscar hit Cuba, as I understand, as a Category 1. And of course, we had even larger hurricanes with Milton and Helene that hit the United States. Now, obviously, the devastation from both of those is significant. But if you look at the response and even the fact that in Western North Carolina, areas that were without power, that were basically inaccessible, are getting power back relatively quickly. And when they didn't have power back, we're getting resources in also very quickly. Whereas in Cuba, you're seeing signs of people, just trying to get to government markets, almost a scarcity of food. Very, very quickly after that. We could contrast also Milton, where, Governor DeSantis, I think, wisely pre-positioned some power lines and linesmen to clean things up right after Milton and get power up and running in that area. So, I think there's a very real contrast between the systems that exist. You mentioned the crumbling infrastructure. Cuba's been a Marxist-Leninist country since the 1960s, the United States with free market capitalism. And it turns out that the prosperity that our friends on the left talk about with Cuba really only existed because of massive subsidies coming into Cuba from the Soviet Union during the Cold War. And so, we see, I think, a very vivid demonstration of the difference between those two economic systems.
So we have that contrast in terms of, in fact, there's very little non-governmental organizations because they've pretty much suppressed the church there. So you don't have groups like Samaritan's Purse and others domestically working to help get families back online and supplied. But you also see, you mentioned the 1960s where there was the infusion of capital from the communist regimes to bolster Cuba. Is that a possibility, again, with their infrastructure crumbling, that we could see Russia, China, Venezuela, of course, Venezuela is having their own issues, move in right there 90 miles from our coast?
Yeah, so 2 points. Briefly, just to piggyback off your point on the faith-based organizations. We are so used to Samaritan's Purse, Operation Blessing, Convoy of Hope, Catholic Charities, and others going in immediately after disasters that, it takes any government, even a government like ours that's more free market oriented, a little bit longer to get in. That's not happening in Cuba. That is another key impact and key reason for those differences. In terms of other governments coming in, I think absolutely. We know that Russia, China, and Iran have all been heavily invested in Venezuela. We know that Russian troops and I believe forces also from Cuba and potentially China were supporting Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro against the democratically elected Juan Guaido, who was elected in 2017 in Venezuela. So keeping the Maduro regime, which is descendant from Chavez, in power. And so we could very easily see a similar system in Cuba. And of course, China is very, very interested in increasing their influence in Latin America. Russia is interested in projecting power where it can. And so I would say that it is very possible that we could see China and Russia reaching out to try to prop up their allies in Cuba and also make infrastructure investments. And like you said, very, very close to America's shore, which would be, there's a reason why the Cuban Missile Crisis happened, and a lot of that in the Cold War, and a lot of that was geography.
Well, we saw just months ago where Russian nuclear-capable subs were coming into Cuba. So this is not far-fetched to think that they could make this as an outpost.
Absolutely. And something that's very important for your listeners to understand. China, Russia, Iran, Venezuela, and Cuba may have ideological differences, but they're all committed to the decrease of American power and destroying American hegemony, which is why Russia is buying weapons now from Iran. China is heavily invested economically in Iran, and all of these countries have invested in Venezuela. And Cuba has also been tied in with the Venezuelan regime. So even if there's not necessarily ideological uniformity, they all agree America's bad, America's the enemy, and free market capitalist democracy needs to be taken down a peg.
All right, so Dr. Nolte, we've kind of diagnosed the problem, the situation there from a foreign policy perspective, as well as domestic. I mean, I think this highlighting the differences between the two ideologies should affect our vote come November the 5th here in this country, because we're beginning to see the elements of that Marxist ideology emerge in our political system. But from a foreign policy perspective, with an eye on what's happening there, what should we be doing as a country?
So domestically, I think take seriously the people that have told us for decades that they see Cuba as a potential model. You know, when they talk about the Cuban healthcare system, keep in mind the fact that they can't even get the power back on, and you know, if that's what they want to bring here, take them seriously. From a foreign policy perspective, I think the U.S. needs to be aggressively countering the Russia, China, Iran alliance anywhere that is active, and that means Venezuela, and that means Cuba. And I think, you know, it's time to reconsider whether we are okay with a permanent failed socialist state 90 miles off of our shore that's going to continually be a place that people who don't like America are going to go to as a safe harbor. And I think, you know, we need to have a very serious discussion about that in the next administration after the election.
Very interesting. That's a good point. Dr. A.J. Nolte, I want to thank you for joining us. As always, appreciate your insights.
Thank you. Happy to be here.